Surprise, you probably weren't expecting a Scaffolds update on Inauguration Day, but here we are. Recently, there's been an ongoing conversation in the chemical ecology community, particularly within the chemical ecology multi-state group, which is based here in the Northeast, about the challenges of bringing non-toxic insect behavior modifying chemicals to market. These substances discussed here in this conversation as semiochemicals face significant regulatory hurdles that disproportionately affect small businesses and limit innovation. Given the current focus on improving government efficiency, I really saw this as the perfect opportunity to explore these regulatory challenges and their impact on commercializing sustainable solutions. In this episode, I dive into the topic with Dr. Agenor Mafra-Neto, CEO and president of Isca Technologies, a company he founded from the ground up. I also share more about his journey, as stories like this are really a source of inspiration for me. Really stories of individuals turning ideas into companies, people from other places building businesses here in the US, and just generally any and all success stories of people who have built something for themselves. The regular Scaffolds content will return in the last week of March, so not long till we're back to it. So until then, enjoy this special episode. I'm here today on Scaffolds podcast with Dr. Agenor Mafra-Neto. He is the CEO of Isca Technologies based in Riverside, California. We've been working together in some capacity since probably about 2016 when I started working with his product Splat in Florida under Dr. Lucas Stilinski. So welcome, Agenor.
Thank you, Monique. Really nice to be here.
So what we're going to do today is I wanted to give a background on Agenor's company, Isca, and also discuss some of the challenges that they experience trying to move basically what we're being told by the broader community, products that are desired by people to be used in agriculture because they're more sustainable, because they're more environmentally friendly, the challenges it takes to get those through the regulatory procedure and hopefully create some awareness around that so that we can change some of those regulatory processes. So first I wanted to get into Agenor, his story, the background of Isca as a company, and talk about some of their products and how they came to be. Can you tell me a little bit about how you first came to the United States and how you got into this field?
Monique, let me tell you a little bit about my background, like in Brazil still, before I came to the States, okay? Because I think it's important just to frame the whole thing. I come from a very, very small town in the south of Brazil. My grandfather was the Lutheran minister in town, but with the Green Revolution in Brazil, he decided to invest in farming. And as he invested in farming, he also was the founder of Co-op, which became like the second largest co-op in Latin America, called Cotrijuí. Then my father came. He was a lawyer in town, and then he got together with the local dentist and the local physician, and they created this investment group that they started investing in farms. This whole thing was like, to feed the world and that kind of stuff, like noble causes and noble objectives in terms of farming. So our weekends we spend all weekends like going from farm to farm and driving hundreds to thousands of miles every weekend to visit these farms. And eventually they grew to having more than a dozen farms from the south all the way to the Cerrado in Brazil. Really great experience to grow with that. No? And as a kid, I really loved these farms because I loved the growing cycles, but especially I loved the animals that we had in the areas of forest. I used to watch nature programs on TV, and David Attenborough was my hero. I wanted to be the Brazilian David Attenborough. So I would go to the farms, and then I would stay out there, look to see animals and their behaviors and that kind of stuff. And I was like 8, 9, 10 years old. But then the turning point for me was when we had a friend in one of the farms, the closest farm to town, and this guy was the guy that used to take care of the animals, and he committed suicide drinking an insecticide. As a 9, 10-year-old, for me, that was like, I had like that black and white idea of insecticide. So if an insecticide like that killed my friend was being sprayed all over the farm, what does it mean to all the animals that are in forest, all the people that are going to feed on that. And it was really hard for me to make sense of it. Since I had a huge access to agronomists from that co-op, I started asking, so what can we do to change that, And most of the agronomists were saying, no, these insecticides are safe. There's no way to change. This is the way we do. It works and that kind of stuff. Till one day I went to visit a friend, this woman that a biocontrol scientist at the local university. And she showed me how predatory insects like ladybugs and little wasps were controlling pests in her little plots. I started thinking, okay, maybe the road that people use in agronomy, everybody is studying that to bring solutions. Maybe I should go into biology and try to find a solution from there. But I couldn't see, for example, doing that, what that lady was doing in little plots, how to bring that to large farms like my parents. So then that basically set up, I think, my whole career. Like I went to the University of Unicamp in Brazil to start working with fungus, like anthropopathogenic fungi. And then I found about sex pheromones. So I decided to learn more about sex pheromones. And then eventually I did my master's in ecology, in the ecology program, with sex pheromones for the management of pink bollworm in cotton. So we developed like a little homemade trap, did mass trapping, and we reduced the cost of pheromones, which was really high in Brazil, to almost nothing with this mass trapping. And then after that, I came to the US. I was invited by Brain Cardet to do my PhD with him to understand the behavior behind these pheromones, these semiochemicals. And we started looking at what are the mechanisms behind of the males to the pheromone sources. That's the beginning of the whole thing. Just a couple of things, like I did that. The first paper that I published was on Nature, so it was downhill from there, but I was really proud of that. Then after that, I went and worked with Tom Baker at the Iowa State. Was the first grant that I wrote, and the grant was for the puffers or misters. So we developed the puffer system with that, and I was really excited about doing something that was going to be applied in the field.
Where I want to continue with that would be plenty of people do PhDs, but not many PhDs, especially in entomology, turn this into a company. So when you went to Iowa, were you seeing the background of sort of the commercial development, or what was the real spark to inspire you to want to create a company?
It was interesting. I got that paper published in Nature. I called my dad to celebrate that paper in Nature, telling him, hey, this is amazing. This is a big thing. So he let me bask a little bit on my glory. And then he said, after a while, he said, hey, I understand that this is a big deal for you, but how does that help the Brazilian farmer? And I was like, I don't know. And then we talked a little bit more, and then said, hey, I would love to bring sex pheromones to Brazil, to help pest management in Brazil. And the funny thing, Monique, is that weekend, my father was watching his farmer program on TV Saturday morning, 6 o'clock in the morning. And then the head of the Brazilian Fruit Growers Association was on national TV telling everybody that the growers in Brazil had to smuggle pheromone traps and lures in order to monitor pests in Brazil, and that we need to change legislation. We need to bring the pheromone industry to Brazil. So my father got his phone number, and I called the president of the Apple Growers Association like that Saturday, and we end up talking for hours. This is the time when phones were really expensive, and all the communication was done by telephone or letters. And I called and I said, hey, I might be able to help. He said, okay, so what I want to do here in Brazil, I want to I want to have pheromones available to the growers. And it cannot be so expensive that it becomes non-viable. And I also want this to be available all the time and not here and there. So I told him that I'd love to do that. And he said, okay, so there are three things here. Okay. The product has to be always available and, if possible, manufactured in Brazil. It has to be affordable and effective. And three, we need to lobby to change the legislation together. And that for me, Monique, was my dream. So together we got a World Bank's fund to eradicate codling moth, Cydia pulmonella from Brazil. It was like an invasive species coming from probably from Argentina. And it was like in restricted areas in several cities in Brazil. And we did attract and kill, and we eventually eradicated the pest from these urban settings and some small orchards.
So you were able to get the pheromone manufactured in Brazil, or were you shipping them?
No, the pheromone I couldn't get manufactured in Brazil, but I was able to get the formulation manufactured in Brazil. So I was able to formulate the pheromone, and its active ingredients into traps, lures, and devices to attract and kill.
Formulation chemistry is quite a bit different from, your work as somebody who is studying behavior and chemical ecology. So how'd you make that connection?
Well, for me to study behavioral moth in wind tunnels, I had to be extremely good at doing serial dilutions of pheromones and formulating them in whatever device I was using. So in order to do that, to figure out how the dose response was, I had to start formulating. And then to go into a new formulation, then it becomes like there was a lot of learning, to say the least. The other thing that I started seeing as I started formulating pheromones was that the solutions for pheromones in around the globe, they were all based on devices that were hand applied to the field, like brack system, plastic systems that you put in the field and release the pheromone slowly. And when I was looking at how growers actually use their pest control solutions, most of them are applied by tractors, by airplanes, and so I wanted to land into something that we could apply mechanically in the field. So my journey went from providing the growers in Brazil with an attract and kill device, and then start working towards a formulation that would be mechanically applied. And that brought me to waxes and emulsions and other products like that.
I guess my next question on that would be, so you really were testing ideas in the Brazilian market. And what were your thoughts? Like, is this how you transitioned into basically a US based company? Were you testing all these ideas out experimentally in Brazil? And then, like, where do you make the jump from these ideas that you're test running to let's build a business around these products?
Yeah. So the company was, because of that first sale with the Brazilian apple growers for the eradication of codling moth, and a sale that was sustained over the years, I was able to have commercialization from the very beginning at a very high level that allowed me to sustain my job. I was still working at UCR, the university, but having this job on the side that was paying significantly more, paying off, giving me a lot of pleasure. No? Now the deal is then how we started developing these products. So the Brazilian market was a market that wanted to have finished products and was paying for that. So that allowed me to commercialize in Brazil. In the US, I tried to get into the market here, and it was a little bit more difficult because it was a more established market already with the growers had accepted the ropes and the racks, and they had systems for that, and it was difficult to penetrate that market. However, in the US, there are like mechanisms to fund research and development called Small Business Innovation Research Grants. SBIRs. And so I used the SBIRs to develop new products, to develop the splat product that you worked with, and then start looking at other things other than pheromones to modify the behavior of bugs. Pheromones are great, but you're always dealing with a single species, one or two species that you can suppress with that pheromone. Whereas if you use like the smell of plants, the smell of fruits, or other things like that, you can address a cohort of insects and have one solution that takes care of most of the insects of that cohort. And that allows you to be able to bring solutions that are a little bit more sophisticated, but also that allow you to, with one application, you can suppress an entire cohort of insects in your field. Much less expensive proposition to the grower.
I think in our realm of jargony science, we call those semiochemicals, which is basically just a fancy word for chemicals that convey information to insects, whether they want to go there, attractants, or whether they want to stay away, a repellent, or in the case of a sex pheromone, hey, this is where your mate is, and you're going to be a successful agent of reproduction. The next thing I want to ask you is, so it sounds like you were working towards the commercialization. You had this awesome market in Brazil to be able to test out things and see how they work in the field. But were there any particular values or principles that you prioritized in the creation of Isca?
Oh, yeah. So it's interesting because when I talked with the president of the Apple Growers Association, he brought like these principles to me. Like, it has to be something effective, easy to use, and economic. It has to make economic sense to the grower. So working on those three things allowed me to more or less guide how the whole process should work. So it has to be something that the grower can apply in the field. It cannot be so much more expensive than the use of insecticides that the grower is used to use. And it has to be effective as insecticides or better, in order to take over the market that already exists. And so these seem to be simple principles, but they are very, very difficult, because if you're trying to bring something that works at almost at the same price of an insecticide, an insecticide usually is a product that a large company sells to a large number of growers to suppress a large number of species. When you're working with semiochemicals, you have to bring that economy of scale, having a much, much smaller market, a niche market. So it's a difficult thing to bring a solution that will cost the grower $10 an acre when you're dealing with small volumes of specialty chemicals like pheromones. No? So bringing other semiochemicals that also are attractant, like, for example, smells of fruit or flowers and things like that are much less expensive than pheromones, allows us to bring solutions that fit that cost that the grower is willing to accept, to adopt our products.
I want to put a timeline on things real quick. So you arrived in the US in what year? And then Isca, which I don't think we've said this yet, but Isca means insect in Portuguese, right?
Isca means lure.
Lure in Portuguese.
Lure
okay.
In Portuguese,
so yeah, give us a little bit of a timeline, and then I think we can launch into deeper questions about what we need to change in order to facilitate the movement of these products into the market.
Sounds good. So I got my master's on the 8th day of the 8th month of 88. So, and I came to the US on the 18th of that month. So I spent about 6 months in Florida, and then I came to UMass in 89, and I finished my PhD, I think in 93. And then I went to the University of Iowa to work with Tom Baker. I left in 96, and I was hired by UCR in 96 and stayed till 2000, 99, 2000. And I started the company Isca in 96 when I came to UCR. It was when my first daughter was coming to the world, and I was thinking, how can I support a family with researcher salary? And it was very I couldn't see how to do. So that was one of my motivations too. And then by 97, both Isca US and Isca Brazil were formed. And till about 2024, we are dealing with more or less the same devices that other people were dealing in the market. And by 2024, we started bringing flowable formulations, slow release flowable formulations like Splat to the market, and started exploring other things other than pheromones as attractants, semiochemicals that are attractants, repellents, and other things like that were not the traditional moth pheromones, the straight chain Lepidoptera pheromones.
So, as we transition into the next section of this interview, where we talk more about the regulatory side, I'm going to give a bit of a summary of what I see as the lay of the land and what I think generally are some challenges to innovation and the actual market of what producers use. So, the way I'm seeing this is that you have these very large insecticide companies. So, we're thinking BASF, we're thinking FMC and Bayer, who are creating these synthetic chemicals that sometimes have a narrow range of killing off insects and sometimes can be very broad spectrum. But the company behind that has a team of lawyers and a very large group of researchers that can overcome a lot of the regulatory hurdles that get in the way to moving things to market. And so what I see is that you do see these smaller companies, Isca included, where they're trying to move products into the market, but maybe they don't have the swath of resources to really push the needle either politically or to just fight back on really complex regulatory rules. So I guess that's how I'm seeing things, but there's really more specifics to this. And I think that we're in a unique position right now where there's pressure to grow things more sustainably, but we're not moving the innovations to market quick enough to be able to make that change quickly, yet we're getting demand from consumers and we're getting top-down pressures from the government to say we need to do this more sustainably. We need to use softer chemistries. We need to, quote unquote, be like Europe and use no insecticides. These are the things we're hearing. So as the CEO of a small company, I think what I'm really interested to dig into here is what are the challenges? Are there certain things that could be changed that could help us move products that are more sustainable and can meet price margin into the market?
Mm-hmm. So, Monique, the thing is that the whole market of crop protection has been developed for having the like conventional insecticides that are broad spectrum toxic in mind. Is like to protect the environment. After Silent Spring, EPA came in to regulate this insecticides, and it's really important work and very helpful. However, the problem with the legislation that we have for insecticides and is that the legislation was created for these very toxic molecules. So you need to have all this swath of toxicological work and figure out how that insecticide is degraded in the environment and all these different things, which are highly regulated tests that need to be done and extremely expensive. So when you're dealing with an insecticide, you have to do that for one insecticide that you're going to use for corn, cotton, and all the pests that are in all these different commodities. When you're working with semiochemicals, you're basically working with one or a group of species for a certain crop. So a much, much smaller market share. And so you have a very, very small budget to work with. So if an insecticide costs at least $1 to $2 million to get registration, the problem is that EPA is more or less blind when you bring a new compound that is like a semiochemical that is almost non-toxic and all those things. They are almost blind to the fact that that's non-toxic, etc. You need to do all the tests, all the work for the regulatory registration, no? And that becomes extremely expensive for small companies like ours. And also it becomes difficult to do in small budgets. There are a few things that can be done. One of them is that in the 80s, the groups that were working with pheromones, Lepidoptera pheromones, got EPA to agree that Lepidoptera pheromones were not toxic. And there was a change in legislation that allowed products using pheromones to bypass many of these tests and regulatory burden that insecticides had. And that made the pheromone industry take off and kind of flourish in the United States because of legislation, a change in legislation that happened in 87. Now, from then on till now, there's no other major change in legislation that happened. So all the new semiochemicals that were discovered, to repel, to attract, and they are in limbo in terms of legislation. And not so much in limbo. They just fall into the conventional insecticide approach for EPA. And that is something that takes a lot of time and a lot of money to do. Time, effort, and money. Almost impossible to bring new formulations to the market.
So you're basically saying they're being looked at the same as an insecticide, which is intentionally created based on certain pathways to cause mortality in the insect. Where this is not aiming at mortality of the insect necessarily, it's aiming at behavioral manipulation. So we can push insects away, we can pull them into the system or pull them to specific places. So you think they need to create an entire different categorization? And so what would the ideal be?
Look, the way that that EPA look at straight chain Lepidoptera pheromones, now the moth pheromones, was a good way of categorize a group of chemicals that tend to be harmless to the environment and known target organisms. Now, we should try to do the same thing for these semiochemicals that are, found in nature and that can attract, repel, modify the behavior, and that are very labile, that stay in the environment and evaporate quickly. We need to create a set of legislation or bring them to the same legislation that is set for, say, straight chain Lepidoptera pheromone. You don't need to create something whole new legislation. And for EPA, it's really hard to get out of the regulatory book that they have for insecticides, and it's hard to create exceptions. But I think that since the 80s, there has been so much progress in chemical ecology with so many solutions that have been brought up that in the United States, they are sitting on the shelves because we cannot get them passed through EPA, through regulatory. It's too expensive or takes too long or both. And whereas in other places, we can use the same solutions without much regulatory burden. And this is like one of the examples is like this attract and kill systems that we provide the grower with an attractant, a phagostimulant. They add an insecticide and they use, say, 98% less insecticide in the field, reduce the footprint, attract only the insects that they need to the insecticide. And the regulatory for those products is extremely simple. Whereas in the United States, it's an impossible process.
So I want to just make sure I define phagostimulant. So that's a chemical that entices the insect to feed or make contact with whatever this chemical is. It's like a feeding attractant. It makes them want to feed. So what are the markets you think that are more wide open?
So there are two classes of semiochemicals that are really ripe for changing legislation. One is for repellents in agricultural use. So you are basically putting something on a tree or a bush or in the crop that the insect tends not to go to that area. No, that's a simple system. And the other one that is, I think, much, much more important is blends of odors from plants and other food sources that can be used to entice the pest to manipulate, to feed on the formulation. Those are the two places where a change in legislation could bring tremendous opportunities for the reduction of the impact of agriculture and in terms of the environment and non-target organisms, and then at the same time bring a tremendous higher effectiveness of crop protection to the growers.
And I think in a lot of cases, these products aren't even being put directly on the crop. Something that's outside of the crop as well, which is the other thing that I remember in California, I was trying to get some things approved by the Organic Association there. And it was an absolute quagmire to prove to them, this is not going to touch the crop. This is existing outside the crop. Even if it had a very small dose of insecticide, this was very controversial, even if it's hanging inside of a trap. I mean, remember when we were trying to do the attract and kill for Asian citrus psyllid? It's next to impossible to convince them that this is not going to touch the plant, even if it's something that's contained inside a device.
Yeah, and that's the problem that we end up facing is like there are some dogmas that exist that are not necessarily based on science, that or someone wrote the legislation or the rules for organic or for EPA in one way, and there's no way to go around that because, for example, some of the semiochemicals that I was talking about that attract insects, and if you put, say, 1% of the insecticide that you use, you are going to spray, do a cover spray. You put 1 or 2% of that insecticide in the formulation, and then you put that in a strip in the middle of the field. That it has the same effect as like the cover spray, but now you're using 1 or 2% of the insecticide load that you're going to use, and you're only attracting the pest to that. Those are usually, we are using semiochemicals that you find sometimes in higher dose in your pizza or the fruit that you are eating, or like in food, or so it's like but then EPA treats that as radioactive toxic product that needs to be dealt with, and meanwhile FDA has that approved for you to add to your Pringles. Like it's like something that just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I think there's a big disconnect between the FDA and the chemistries that they see going into the food versus the EPA and how they're viewing environmental toxicity of the same chemistries.
Yeah, and Monique, like think about products that we have one product that has like 3 or 4 components. All of them are used in jellies and other fruit-based products, okay? That FDA approves to add on to those jellies and food products that you end up using, in your ice cream or jelly or whatever. EPA basically doesn't allow you to spray that on the crop that is going to produce that fruit. So it's like FDA allows you to put that directly in your food. EPA doesn't allow to even hit the leaves of the crop that you are using in the field to produce the fruit that is going to be, people are going to eat later on, with some of them with the same products or semiochemicals that you are adding to the crop. So it's like, it just doesn't make sense.
I hate to be sort of pessimistic on this, but when it comes to the lobbying, the food groups, like say Nabisco, has an amazing team to lobby. So that's also where the funding structure affects the ability of things to move forward, because some of this is political. And having enough funding to be able to send someone to stay forever in Washington, D.C. and go just take meetings on the Hill and create awareness of these issues. I mean, I think these are the things that really set apart and why I think we'll be limited in innovation in agricultural products because of these barriers, these hurdles that it's very difficult to get them communicated up the chain of command, because we're not talking these massive businesses with massive lobbying efforts.
Yeah, and the other thing also, Monique, you have to, if you step on the shoes of people at EPA, they are being attacked by both sides. They are being attacked by the left, the radical left and the radical right, and everything in between. Why? Because they They are regulating insecticides, and they are allowing insecticides to be used. And at the same time, they are protecting us enough. And then on the other side, you have the right saying that, hey, we don't need protection. Let the industry, let us do whatever we want. The market regulates itself. So they have a conundrum. If they allow certain things, they are attacked by one side. If they allow other things, they are attacked by the other side. So it's very hard to be innovative at EPA. At FDA, you might be more. There's not so much of, they are not under scrutiny all the time. But at the same time, I think that we need to figure out how to find solutions here to the semiochemical field. Otherwise, we are not going to see innovations that have been created in the past, since the 80s. We are not going to see these innovations getting into the market here in the US. We are going to see them in the market in other places, Mexico, Brazil, Latam, Africa, Asia, but not in the US, and maybe not even in Europe.
The regulatory market entry is the biggest barrier, but at the same time, like I said when we started this part of the discussion, there's this immense consumer demand, and there's this immense, on the other side of regulatory demand, like we see in New York State and in California, I think are the two most strict on, it takes an extra 3 years just to bring a product to these markets, usually. And this is even with big companies that have a ton of money to throw at it. Yeah. It's a delayed entry into the market. So I guess the last question I want to end on is, what do you see as, let's say, the top 3 biggest innovations for semiochemicals that you think we could see brought into production?
If legislation was softened?
Yeah, I kind of blow it up. Like if we could move these things in, what innovations could be provided?
Okay, let me just bring another thing here. EPA doesn't know what to do with semiochemicals, certain semiochemicals. No, they don't fit the category of an insecticide. They don't fit. So, for example, what can be brought up if legislation were to soften and be easier to manage? We will be able to get a large number of systems that can be used to enhance insecticide effectiveness in the field using significantly less insecticide. So products to attract and kill stink bugs, to attract and kill moths or beetles, that you're applying this formulation in less than 1% of the crop, and you are using less than 1% of the insecticide that you are going to use in the field. So attract and kill is the most important formulations that we would come up and take over these markets. And also they are closer to what a grower would use anyway. And then another thing that would come in would be repellents, the use of repellents for crop protection in a much broader way, and which is also being stopped by legislation. And finally, systems to manipulate beneficial insects, like bringing predators to a field, bringing pollinators to the field, protecting, enhancing pollination, enhancing predation or parasitism by beneficial insects.
Yeah, so in many cases, what this is, it's making the products that are already there more effective through using scientific information to manipulate the behavior. We know these chemistries work in terms of manipulating the behavior, and we can have additive effects. It's not, in every case, the removal of the insecticide completely, but it's a more judicious use.
That's exactly what it is. It's like using the power of the semiochemical to attract, phagostimulate, and then using the power of the insecticide to kill the pest. But now not doing this crazy thing that is to apply on every inch of every plant that is in the field, but then just put as a bait in the field in a small line, a small area that allows the insects, the target insect, to come and feed on that and die. So it is a synergistic use of this tremendous powers of insecticide and semiochemicals together, giving something that you never had before.
Well, I think this is a perfect place to end. I am so thankful that you spent this time to talk about this. There's not a lot of people that I see as interactive in the industry in terms of interacting with researchers to be able to have this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Monique.